Jerusalem, July 7, 2002. At Al-Makassed Hospital in East Jerusalem, the hallway lights are dim at 0340 hours, and Tariq Hamdi is still groggy from an emergency appendectomy. But the footsteps outside his room aren't surgeons. 6 figures in Palestinian Red Crescent uniforms roll in a gurney and present a transfer order stamped by a ministry that may not have signed it. Nurses freeze. Armed relatives stare. No one wants a diplomatic explosion. Then the ambulance doors close, and the road to Ramallah becomes a road to interrogation. The question isn't if they can take him, it's what it costs. This is the story of how intelligence operatives disguised as paramedics kidnapped a commander from his hospital bed. In the early 2000s, Israel and Palestinian factions were locked in a cycle of attacks and reprisals that made every street corner in Jerusalem a potential flashpoint. The Second Intifada had transformed the landscape into what intelligence analysts called a distributed battlefield. No front lines, no uniforms, just networks of operatives moving through civilian infrastructure. Borders weren't just political, they were weapons. East Jerusalem existed in a legal gray zone, close enough to Israeli authority to be reachable but culturally surrounded by Palestinian networks. One wrong move could ignite a crisis that would echo from the hospital ward to the United Nations Security Council. Al-Makassed Hospital sat directly in this pressure zone. Founded in 1968, it served as the primary Arab medical facility in East Jerusalem, treating roughly 200,000 patients annually. The 6-story building on Mount of Olives Road operated under a complex arrangement: Israeli municipal jurisdiction, Palestinian administration, international funding. Every patient transfer, every security decision, every piece of paperwork crossed invisible lines that could be weaponized by either side. For intelligence services, this made it both an opportunity and a minefield. Tariq Hamdi was not a household name. Palestinian sources described him as a mid-level Islamic Jihad operations coordinator. Israeli intelligence files, portions of which would later surface in legal proceedings, painted a more specific picture. He wasn't the public face giving press conferences or the bomb maker assembling devices. He was a connector. His operational value came from a specific skill. He could move a plan from concept to execution across multiple cells without leaving an easy trail. Associates described him as methodical, never impulsive. He knew routes, he knew safe houses. He knew who answered to whom and what came next. By mid-2002, Israeli counterterrorism units had tracked Hamdi for approximately 14 months. Intercepted communications from March indicated he was coordinating with cells in both the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Analysts noted a pattern. When Hamdi's communications increased, attacks followed within 2 to 3 weeks. The threat assessment classified him as a network facilitator. Not the loudest figure, but one whose removal could disrupt multiple operational chains simultaneously. His defining characteristic was mobility. He rarely stayed in one location more than 72 hours. Then came the vulnerability window. On July 5, 2002, Hamdi was admitted to Al-Makassed Hospital with acute appendicitis. The surgery occurred the following day. Intelligence services monitoring the hospital, through methods that remain classified, confirmed he would remain sedated and under observation for at least 48 hours. For the first time in over a year, a high-value target was pinned to a predictable location, surrounded by witnesses, medically vulnerable. The strategic logic that followed was the logic of counterterrorism under public pressure. Israeli security doctrine in this period operated on what internal documents called the prevention imperative, the mandate to stop attacks before they occurred, using methods calibrated to minimize collateral damage while maximizing intelligence yield. When analysts believed an attack chain was forming, they had 3 options: long-range elimination, ground assault, or capture. Each carried distinct costs. An airstrike was unthinkable. The hospital's location in densely populated East Jerusalem meant civilian casualties would be catastrophic. A ground assault, military units breaching the hospital, would trigger international condemnation and potentially armed resistance from hospital guards and family members. Israeli planners had studied the 1982 Sabra and Shatila massacre aftermath. They understood how medical facility violence could become permanent propaganda. Waiting was equally unacceptable. Intelligence assessments suggested Hamdi would be discharged within 72 hours, after which he would disappear back into the distributed network. That left capture. But the obstacles were brutal. Hamdi's room was on the 4th floor of the main building. Armed relatives, estimates ranged from 3 to 5 individuals, maintained a constant presence outside his door. Hospital security, though not heavily armed, would respond to any overt intrusion. Palestinian Authority personnel, who maintained informal liaison relationships with certain hospital staff, would be notified within minutes of any suspicious activity. The operation would need to pass through multiple gates simultaneously. Physical security, cultural credibility, and moral legitimacy. During the post-operation debrief, portions of which were later referenced in court documents related to administrative detention procedures, one officer described the paradox. We needed an action that looked so routine, so bureaucratically normal, that stopping it would seem more dangerous than allowing it. The key insight was that hospitals are designed to transfer patients. Medical paperwork creates compliance. Uniforms create deference. If the operation could mimic the exact rhythm of a legitimate medical procedure, resistance would require someone to explicitly accuse medical personnel of abduction, an allegation so severe that most staff would hesitate. The planning consumed approximately 36 hours. By July 6th, authorization came from what intelligence historians identify as the Special Operations Directorate, the unit responsible for actions that exist in the space between declared military operations and covert intelligence gathering. The doctrine guiding this operation was known internally as soft penetration, entering a denied area not through force, but through institutional mimicry. The logic was straightforward. Authority is performed, not inherent. If operatives could perform medical authority convincingly enough, the hospital itself would become an unwitting accomplice. But one critical element remained unresolved. Real Palestinian Red Crescent personnel operated throughout East Jerusalem. Any encounter with actual medical teams would expose the operation instantly. Timing became the lock on the door. Intelligence officers monitoring hospital shift schedules identified a narrow window, 0300 to 0400 hours on July 7th. Night shift staffing was minimal. Most family members would be fatigued. The Red Crescent's own emergency units were statistically less likely to be operating in that specific hospital during those hours, based on dispatch records from the previous 6 months. By the evening of July 6th, all elements were in position. But first, the cover identities needed to be tested one final time. Not against Israeli security, but against the most dangerous audience of all. Medical professionals who would know instantly if something felt wrong. The operation was designated Hayyi Adam, Hebrew for human life, a designation that appeared in no official records, but surfaced later in testimony from hospital staff who overheard the phrase used in post-incident discussions. The name itself was operational cover. If anyone intercepted communications referencing Hayyi Adam, the phrase was innocuous enough to mean legitimate medical concern. The infrastructure began with documentation. Intelligence services had access to authentic Palestinian Red Crescent letterhead through previous operations. The exact acquisition method remains classified, though analysts suggest it came from a combination of photographic surveillance of genuine documents and at least one cooperative source within medical administration networks. The forged transfer order created for this operation contained 7 specific elements designed to pass rapid inspection. A patient identification number that matched Al-Makassed's numbering system, a receiving facility name, Palestine Medical Complex in Ramallah, that existed and regularly accepted transfers, a physician's signature that mimicked the style of known doctors, a ministry stamp photographically reproduced from a genuine 2001 document, a medical justification citing post-surgical monitoring requirements, a transfer urgency classification marked as routine rather than emergency to avoid triggering additional protocols, and a reference number that followed the Palestinian Authority's administrative coding structure. Each element was calibrated for a specific failure point. If a nurse questioned the patient ID, it would check against hospital records. If she questioned the receiving facility, it was real enough to delay verification. If she questioned the ministry stamp, visual inspection would match her memory of previous transfers. The document wasn't designed to be perfect. It was designed to be good enough that questioning it required multiple phone calls, cross-referencing, and explicit accusations, all of which create friction that most medical staff would avoid during a night shift. The equipment was acquired through a parallel channel, one authentic Palestinian Red Crescent, an ambulance, Mitsubishi L300 series, white with Red Crescent markings, was obtained through methods that Israeli security services have never publicly confirmed. Vehicle acquisition in intelligence operations typically follows 3 pathways: theft with false documentation, purchase through intermediary entities, or temporary borrowing during periods when the vehicle would not be immediately missed. The ambulance used in this operation bore registration plates that matched a genuine Red Crescent vehicle. But surveillance footage from the hospital parking area, reviewed later by Palestinian investigators, showed minor discrepancies in the rear marking configuration that suggested a carefully constructed duplicate rather than the authentic vehicle. Inside the ambulance, operatives had installed standard emergency medical equipment: a gurney with proper restraint straps, an oxygen system, monitoring devices that appeared functional, and medication bags filled with saline solution, marked with authentic pharmaceutical labels. The equipment served dual purposes. Functionally, it allowed operatives to perform basic medical tasks if observed. Psychologically, it created what intelligence tradecraft calls environmental consistency. When every visible element matches expectation, the human brain stops looking for inconsistencies. The uniforms came from a more direct source. Palestinian Red Crescent uniforms are not highly secured. They can be purchased or replicated with moderate effort. Intelligence services maintained a collection of regional medical uniforms for operations requiring medical cover. 6 complete uniform sets were prepared: 3 paramedic uniforms with appropriate patches, 2 supervisory uniforms with additional insignia, and 1 driver's uniform. Each was weathered slightly, minor staining, fabric wear, to avoid the too new tell that sophisticated observers watch for. Communication systems were compartmentalized. The team operating inside the hospital carried no radios or phones that could be traced to Israeli networks. Instead, they used a dead-drop system with a support team positioned 3 blocks away. The support team maintained encrypted radio contact with command elements. If the hospital operation failed, the inside team would simply walk out, abort, and disappear. If it succeeded, they would drive to a predetermined junction, where the support team would take custody of the target for transfer to interrogation facilities. Escape routes were mapped with granular precision. From Al-Makassed Hospital to Israeli-controlled territory, 3 primary routes existed. Route 1, down Mount of Olives Road, through the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, toward French Hill. A route that crossed from Palestinian majority areas to Israeli-controlled zones, but required passing 2 potential checkpoints. Route 2, south through Wadi al-Juz, then west toward West Jerusalem, longer, but with fewer formal checkpoints. Route 3, east toward Ma'ale Adumim settlement, the longest route but with the most predictable security environment once past initial neighborhoods. The team selected Route 1 for a specific reason: speed. Once the operation was detected, every minute mattered. The 2 potential checkpoints were both Israeli-controlled, meaning operatives could navigate them with pre-arranged documentation. Palestinian security forces, who might pursue once the abduction was discovered, would be unable to follow past those points without triggering a broader confrontation. The team structure reflected operational psychology more than technical skill. 6 operatives entered the hospital. The lead paramedic, identified in later testimony only as Subject A, had actual emergency medical training from Israeli Defense Forces Medical Corps. His job was to answer clinical questions if challenged, using proper medical terminology and calm authority. The second paramedic, Subject B, handled physical, patient management, and equipment. His role was silent competence, adjusting straps, checking lines, moving with practiced efficiency that discouraged questions. 3 additional operatives maintained peripheral control. They positioned themselves to manage doors, observe corridors, and intercept any interference without appearing to be a security detail. Their instructions were explicit. Never draw weapons inside the hospital unless facing immediate lethal threat. Gunfire would transform a covert operation into an international incident. Better to abort than to shoot. The 6th operative, the driver, remained with the vehicle, engine running, positioned for immediate departure. He carried documents identifying him as a Red Crescent driver on routine transfer duty. If approached by security, his story was simple: waiting for a patient transfer, smoking a cigarette, annoyed about the late-night call. Compartmentalization was absolute. Each operative knew only their specific function, the target's appearance from photographs, and one emergency abort phrase in Arabic: Al-Tadil Lil-Ged, postpone until tomorrow. If anyone spoke that phrase, the operation ended immediately. No explanations, no improvisation. The team would exit, disperse, and extract via separate routes. The planning consumed 16 hours of detailed rehearsal. A mock-up of Al-Makassed's 4th-floor corridor was constructed in a training facility near Petah Tikva. Teams practiced the approach sequence repeatedly, entering with proper body language, maintaining conversational Arabic at the right volume, handling paperwork with casual confidence, managing the gurney through doorways without fumbling. One detail from the rehearsal became critical. Operatives practiced moving while maintaining eye contact with staff, because people who avoid eye contact signal deception. By July 7th, at 0100 hours, the operation entered its final positioning phase. Subject A experienced what he later described in debriefing as legend drift, the psychological moment when false identity begins to feel more real than the original self. During the drive toward East Jerusalem, he found himself mentally rehearsing medical terminology in Arabic, checking imaginary patient charts, inhabiting the role so completely that his own name felt like the fiction. Intelligent psychologists recognize this as a necessary dissociation for deep cover work. The mission continued, July 7, 2002. At 02:45 hours, the ambulance departed from a staging point in the Pisgat Ziev neighborhood, approximately 4 kilometers north of Al-Makassed Hospital. The route took 12 minutes. Subject A sat in the passenger seat, reviewing the transfer documents one final time. Subject B and the 3 peripheral operatives occupied the rear compartment, silent. Each wore a small earpiece, not for communication, but to create the appearance of being on a medical communication network, if observed. At 0300 hours, the ambulance entered the hospital's emergency access drive. This was the first critical juncture. Hospital security typically logged all emergency vehicle entries. But the night shift security desk was positioned facing the main entrance, with the emergency drive visible only through a secondary window. The ambulance parked in a zone marked for emergency transfers, present enough to be legitimate, but angled so that direct observation from the security desk required active effort. The driver remained with the vehicle. 5 operatives exited and entered through the emergency department entrance. They moved with a specific cadence, not rushed, but purposeful. Subject A carried a medical clipboard with the transfer documents visible on top. Subject B handled the gurney. The 3 peripheral operatives walked in a formation that appeared random, but actually created a visual buffer. Anyone watching would focus on the obvious paramedics rather than the less defined figures. The first contact came immediately. An emergency department nurse, later identified as Hanan M., a 12-year veteran of the hospital, looked up from her station. Subject A spoke first in Arabic. Transfer pickup for room 412. Palestine Medical Complex Coordination. He held the clipboard at an angle that made the documents readable, but required the nurse to lean slightly forward. A microaggression of authority that positioned him as the professional seeking cooperation rather than the outsider seeking permission. The nurse frowned. "I don't have notification of any transfer." Her voice carried suspicion, but not alarm. This was unusual, but not impossible. Paperwork delays were common. Subject A's response was calibrated precisely. Ministry authorization came through at 2100 hours. Ramallah coordination confirmed at 2230. Patient stable, post-surgical monitoring recommended at upgraded facility. Each sentence contained verifiable sounding details while providing nothing she could immediately check. The phrase upgraded facility was particularly chosen. It implied criticism of Al-Makassed's capabilities without stating it directly, creating subtle pressure for compliance. The nurse reached for the phone. This was expected. Subject A leaned closer and lowered his voice. "I can wait for your confirmation, but the slot at Palestine Medical Complex is scheduled for 0500 hours. If we miss it, the patient stays here through the weekend." The surgeon indicated monitoring was necessary. The statement contained 3 manipulations: acknowledging her authority to delay, introducing a time pressure that made delay costly, and invoking a physician's medical judgment that superseded administrative concerns. She hesitated. The phone remained in her hand. Subject B used the pause to step slightly forward, gesturing toward the gurney. "We should prepare the patient for transport while you verify. Movement creates momentum. Once preparation begins, stopping it requires explicit confrontation." The nurse set down the phone. "4th floor, room 412. But I'm noting this in the log as transfer pending confirmation." She had chosen the path of least resistance. Allow the preparation to proceed, document her concern. Let someone else make the final decision. The 5 operatives moved toward the elevator. The first obstacle was passed, but the tactical situation was deteriorating. The nurse's notation meant hospital administration would be alerted, possibly within minutes. The window for smooth extraction had just narrowed. At 0320 hours, the elevator doors opened on the 4th floor. The corridor was dimly lit, standard energy conservation during night hours. Room 412 was 20 meters down the hallway on the left side. 3 figures were visible outside the room. 2 men seated in plastic chairs, 1 standing. These were the armed relatives mentioned in intelligence reports. None appeared to be sleeping. Subject A led the approach, maintaining the same purposeful cadence. As they drew closer, one of the seated men, later identified as Hamdi's cousin, Rashid, stood. His right hand moved toward his waistband. Subject A spoke immediately. Red Crescent transfer for Tariq Hamdi. Ministry authorization for post-surgical monitoring. He held the clipboard forward, the gesture simultaneously non-threatening and authoritative. Rashid did not move his hand from his waistband. No one informed the family of any transfer. The authorization came through ministry coordination. The patient's surgeon recommended upgraded monitoring. We have a slot at Palestine Medical Complex that expires at dawn. Subject A kept his voice clinical, bored even, the tone of a professional annoyed at having to explain routine procedures to non-medical personnel. The second seated man, Hamdi's brother, Ahmad, spoke. "Show me the documents." Subject A handed over the clipboard. This was a calculated risk. Ahmad was not medically trained, but he was intelligent. If he examined the documents closely, he might spot inconsistencies. But refusing to show the documents would guarantee confrontation. The documents were designed to pass cursory examination. Stamps looked right, signatures looked right. The bureaucratic language matched Palestinian Authority administrative style. Ahmad read slowly. 30 seconds passed. Subject A maintained relaxed posture, while Subject B positioned the gurney where it partially blocked the corridor. If Ahmad decided to pursue verification, he would have to physically navigate around the gurney, a small friction point that discouraged action. Ahmad looked up. "This says routine transfer. If it's routine, why the pre-dawn timing?" Bed availability at Palestine Medical Complex is managed on a scheduled rotation. The slot allocated for Al-Makassed transfers falls between 0300 and 0500 hours on weekends. If we don't transport now, the next available slot is Monday. The answer was technically plausible. Hospital bed management in the Palestinian Authority healthcare system was notoriously complex, with political and administrative factors creating seemingly arbitrary scheduling. Ahmad handed back the clipboard. "I'm going with him in the ambulance." Subject A shook his head. Red Crescent protocol prohibits non-medical personnel in patient transport vehicles except in pediatric cases or where the patient requires continuous family support. Your brother is sedated and stable. You can follow in your own vehicle. Palestine Medical Complex is 40 minutes drive. This was the critical juncture. Ahmad could insist, creating a confrontation that would require either aborting the operation or using force. Or he could accept the bureaucratic explanation and comply. His decision would depend on one calculation. Did resisting a medical transfer cause more problems than allowing it? Ahmad looked at his cousin. Rashid's hand was still near his waistband. Then Ahmad looked back at Subject A. "I'm calling the hospital administrator." "That's your right. But the patient is medically cleared for transfer, and transport timing is established. If the administrator orders us to wait, we wait. But the slot at Palestine Medical Complex doesn't." Subject A had shifted the burden. Make the call, take responsibility for denying medical care. Ahmad pulled out a mobile phone. Subject B used the moment to address Rashid directly. "Can you help us position the gurney in the room? We need stable floor space for the transfer." The request was a tactical manipulation. By assigning Rashid a helpful role, it reframed him from challenger to participant. Rashid hesitated, then nodded. His hand moved away from his waistband as he turned to open the door to room 412. Inside the room, Tariq Hamdi lay sedated, an IV line running to his left arm, surgical dressing visible on his lower abdomen. He was semi-conscious, aware enough to respond to stimuli but not alert enough to understand his situation. This was the vulnerability window. The operation had reached the point of no return. Ahmad was making a phone call. Hospital administration would be alerted within minutes. Either the team extracted Hamdi now, or they aborted. At 0338 hours, Subject B positioned the gurney parallel to Hamdi's bed. He spoke in the clinical monotone of medical professionals performing routine tasks. "Transfer from bed to gurney on count of 3. Support head and neck. Stabilize IV line. Watch the surgical site." The language created legitimacy. Specific, technical, focused on patient safety. 2 peripheral operatives moved to assist, while the third positioned himself at the doorway, maintaining sight lines to the corridor. Rashid stood near the window, uncertain. Ahmad was visible in the hallway, phone pressed to his ear, pacing. The transfer itself took 45 seconds. Subject B managed Hamdi's head and shoulders. 1 peripheral operative supported his torso, the other positioned his legs. The IV line was transferred without disconnection. Maintaining it was both medical prudence and theater. If anyone observed, they would see medical professionals worried about patient care. The surgical dressing was checked, adjusted. Gurney straps were secured across Hamdi's chest, waist, and legs. Standard transport protocol, but also restraint. Hamdi's eyes flickered open briefly. He murmured something in Arabic, unclear, possibly a question. Subject B responded in the calm voice medical personnel use with sedated patients. "You're being transferred to another hospital for monitoring. Stay still. You're safe." The lie was delivered with such medical authority that even Hamdi, in his compromised state, complied. At 0340 hours, the gurney was ready. Ahmad was still on the phone in the corridor, his voice rising. The conversation was not going well. Either the administrator was questioning the transfer or was unable to confirm it immediately. Either way, the window was closing. Subject A stepped into the corridor. "We need to transport now. The patient's post-surgical monitoring window is time-sensitive." He began moving the gurney toward the elevator, forcing Ahmad to make a decision, physically block them or allow them to proceed. Ahmad held up his hand, still holding the phone. "Wait. The administrator says she has no record. The authorization is ministry level, not hospital administrative. If there's a coordination failure between the ministry and hospital administration, that's a systems issue, but it doesn't supersede the medical transfer order." Subject A kept moving. The gurney was already 3 meters down the corridor. Rashid emerged from the room. His hand moved toward his waistband again. Subject A saw it peripherally and made a calculation. If Rashid drew a weapon, the operation would collapse into violence. Better to create a diplomatic exit than to risk gunfire in a hospital corridor. He stopped the gurney, turned to face Ahmad directly. "I understand your concern. Family wants confirmation before a transfer. That's reasonable. Here's what I can do. I'll give you the direct line for Red Crescent coordination in Ramallah. You can call them, confirm the transfer was authorized, confirm the bed slot at Palestine Medical Complex exists." But I need to transport the patient now, because the window for that slot closes in 90 minutes. If we're delayed and the slot is lost, I'm responsible to my supervisors, and your brother stays here through the weekend with no upgraded monitoring. You make the decision." He handed Ahmad a small paper card with a phone number written on it. The number was real. It connected to a Red Crescent administrative line that would ring but likely not be answered at this hour. The gesture created the appearance of transparency while providing nothing immediately verifiable. Ahmad looked at the card, looked at the gurney, looked at his brother, strapped down, semi-conscious. Then he made the calculation. Better to follow the ambulance and verify at the destination than to create a confrontation that might harm his brother's medical care. "I'm following you to Ramallah." "Of course, that's your right. The route is Highway 1 North. Palestine Medical Complex is on Al-Bireh Road." Subject A provided real directions to a real location. The lie was not the destination given, but the destination intended. The gurney resumed movement. Ahmed stepped aside. Rashid's hand remained near his waistband, but he made no move to draw. The three peripheral operatives maintained their positions, two flanking the gurney, one trailing, in a formation that appeared medical, but functionally created a moving security perimeter. The elevator doors opened. Inside, Subject B maintained the clinical posture, checking Hamdi's IV line, adjusting the pillow under his head. The theater of medical concern. When the doors opened on the ground floor, the emergency department nurse was standing at her station, phone in hand. She had been trying to reach someone, administration, ministry coordination, someone who could confirm or deny the transfer. Subject A addressed her directly as they passed. "Transfer complete. Patient stable. Receiving facility notified. You have our Red Crescent coordination number if there are follow-up questions. Keep moving. Do not pause for conversation." The nurse called out, "I still don't have confirmation. Ministry authorization. Check with your administration in the morning. Patient care takes precedence." Subject A pushed through the emergency exit door. The ambulance was visible 30 meters away, driver at the wheel, engine running. At 03:48 hours, the gurney was loaded into the ambulance. Subject B and one peripheral operative climbed into the rear compartment with Hamdi. Subject A took the passenger seat. The remaining two operatives split off. They would extract separately via prearranged routes. Ahmad was running toward his vehicle, parked in the main lot. Rashid was with him. Within minutes, they would be following. But minutes were enough. The ambulance departed the hospital grounds, turning north on Mount of Olives Road. The route initially matched the directions Subject A had provided. Highway 1 toward Ramallah. Ahmad's vehicle appeared in the rear view approximately 200 meters back, headlights visible. The driver maintained moderate speed, nothing that would signal urgency or evasion. At the Sheikh Jarrah junction, 300 meters from the first Israeli checkpoint, the ambulance made an unexpected right turn onto a side street. Ahmad's vehicle, caught in traffic at a light, could not immediately follow. By the time Ahmad navigated the turn, the ambulance had taken a second right, then a left, disappearing into a residential neighborhood. The driver navigated through pre-scouted routes, emerging on a parallel road that led to the same checkpoint, but from a different approach angle. At 0400 hours, the ambulance reached the checkpoint, an Israeli Defense Forces position marking the boundary between Palestinian-administered East Jerusalem and Israeli-controlled areas. The soldiers on duty had been alerted, not about a kidnapping, about a medical coordination transfer requiring expedited passage. The cover story held even here. Palestinian medical personnel transferring a patient through Israeli checkpoints was unusual but not unprecedented. Medical emergencies sometimes required routing through Israeli-controlled territory for speed. The checkpoint guard glanced at the ambulance, saw the Red Crescent markings, waved it through. Total stop time, 20 seconds. Ahmad's vehicle, approaching the checkpoint 5 minutes later, would face a different reception. Extensive questioning, documentation checks, delays designed to prevent pursuit. By 0420 hours, the ambulance had crossed into territory where Israeli security forces maintained operational control. The route continued north, but no longer toward Ramallah. Instead, it turned west toward Petah Tikva, where a facility known in intelligence documents as Site 39 maintained interrogation rooms and holding cells specifically for high-value detainees extracted from denied areas. Inside the ambulance, Hamdi was regaining consciousness. Subject B had administered a mild sedative through the IV line, enough to keep him compliant but not deeply unconscious. Hamdi opened his eyes, looked around at the unfamiliar faces, tried to speak. Subject B responded in Arabic. "You're being taken for medical monitoring. Stay calm." The deception held even in the final moments. Medical authority as the last layer of control. At 0500 hours, the ambulance entered the secured perimeter of Site 39. Guards. At the gate, Israeli military personnel, no longer maintaining any Red Crescent pretense, opened the barrier. The vehicle proceeded to an underground entrance where a transfer team waited. These personnel wore no medical disguises. They were interrogators, intelligence officers, handlers trained in the specific protocols for processing high-value detainees. Hamdi was removed from the gurney and placed on a standard military stretcher. The IV line was removed. The surgical dressing was checked by an actual military physician. From this point, accounts diverged sharply, and the documentary record fractures. Israeli security services have never officially confirmed the operation occurred. When pressed by human rights organizations and journalists, official responses ranged from no comment to vague statements about security operations conducted according to legal frameworks. The legal framework in question, administrative detention, allows Israeli authorities to hold individuals without charge based on classified intelligence. But administrative detention requires at least minimal documentation. No documentation acknowledging Hamdi's capture was ever released. Palestinian sources, citing family testimony and hospital staff reports, provided a different endpoint. According to these accounts, Hamdi was interrogated over a period of approximately 8 days. The interrogation focused on network structures, names, locations, communication methods, upcoming operations. After 8 days, family sources claim Hamdi died in custody. The official explanation allegedly given to family members, post-surgical complications, was never accompanied by a body, a death certificate, or any documentation that would allow independent verification. The contradiction has never been resolved. Israeli authorities maintain no record exists. Palestinian authorities maintain a death occurred. Independent investigators have found no definitive evidence supporting either conclusion. What remains is testimony, accusation, and the operational reality that once a target crosses from public space into sealed state security space, accountability evaporates. Two details anchor the execution phase without turning it into a blueprint for replication. First, the exploitation of medical legitimacy as a passkey. The operation succeeded because everyone involved, from nurses to family members, made the calculation that challenging medical authority carried greater risk than allowing it to proceed. Second, the handoff from public space to sealed state space. The moment when a person becomes a number, when observation becomes impossible, when the rules change completely. Discovery came in stages, not as a single cinematic revelation. At 04:15 hours, a hospital administrator finally reached the Red Crescent Coordination Center in Ramallah. No transfer had been authorized. No bed slot existed at Palestine Medical Complex. The reference number on the documents was authentic in format but corresponded to a transfer from 6 months earlier. Someone had performed sophisticated bureaucratic forgery. By 0500 hours, Ahmad had been detained at the Israeli checkpoint for questioning. He explained he was following an ambulance carrying his brother. The checkpoint commander had no record of any medical transfer. Ahmad's vehicle was searched. He was photographed, documented, and released 2 hours later with no explanation. When he finally reached the hospital, his brother's room was empty. Palestinian Authority officials issued a statement at 1100 hours declaring the incident a violation of medical neutrality and humanitarian law. The statement called for international investigation and demanded Hamdi's immediate release. Israeli authorities issued no statement. The silence was its own message, neither confirmation nor denial, just a blank wall where accountability should be. Diplomatically, the incident triggered familiar patterns. The International Committee of the Red Cross filed an inquiry. United Nations human rights mechanisms requested clarification. European Union diplomatic staff raised the matter in bilateral meetings. Every inquiry received the same response. No comment. Security matters are not publicly discussed. Israel operates within legal frameworks. No further information would be provided. Strategically, the operation achieved its primary objective: network disruption. Intelligence analysts later documented a measurable decrease in Islamic Jihad operational tempo in the 3 months following Hamdi's capture. Communications intercepts showed confusion, reorganization, delays in planned attacks. Whether this justified the operation depends entirely on your framework for evaluating covert action. A question intelligence services have debated internally for decades without consensus. The cost was broader and more insidious. Trust collapsed. Palestinian medical personnel began questioning every ambulance arrival. Was this a real transfer or another operation? Hospital security protocols tightened, creating friction that delayed legitimate medical care. The Palestinian Red Crescent issued new verification procedures that made actual emergency transfers slower and more bureaucratic. The unintended consequence of sophisticated deception is not just anger. It's the corrosion of systems that depend on trust to function. For operatives involved, the aftermath was procedurally routine. Subject A returned to his standard duties within 48 hours. In his post-operation psychological evaluation, standard protocol for operations involving deep cover identity work, he reported persistent legend drift, describing moments when he would find himself thinking in the medical Arabic phrases he had rehearsed, as if the false identity had carved a permanent channel in his consciousness. The evaluation cleared him for future operations. The moral question persists because both sides have evidence for their position. One perspective argues, Hamdi was an active operations coordinator planning attacks. Capturing him while sedated prevented potential deaths and avoided a gunfight in a crowded hospital that might have killed innocents. The alternative, an airstrike or a raid, would have caused far greater harm. The operation was precise, surgical, and achieved its security objective with 0 collateral casualties. The opposing perspective argues, disguising operatives as medical personnel weaponizes humanitarian trust. It transforms ambulances into threats and hospitals into battlefields. Every future patient Every real paramedic, every doctor now operates under suspicion. The operation didn't just capture one individual. It contaminated the entire medical system in a conflict zone where medical neutrality is already fragile. The long-term cost, measured in delayed treatments, in people afraid to call ambulances, in medical personnel who hesitate at checkpoints, far exceeds any tactical gain. The strategic assessment depends on what you measure. If you measure immediate security outcomes, the operation was effective. If you measure institutional trust, it was catastrophic. If you measure lives potentially saved versus systems potentially broken, the calculation becomes impossible because you're comparing visible outcomes against invisible alternatives. One detail remains undisputed. By 0700 hours on July 7, 2002, Tariq Hamdi had disappeared from Al-Makassed Hospital. Whether he was interrogated, detained, killed, or released under a different identity, no definitive evidence has emerged. The operation's final legacy is not what it achieved, but what it demonstrated. That in modern conflict, the most powerful operations may be those that don't break doors. They break norms. If a state can stop an attack by violating the protections of medicine, is that smart prevention? Or is it crossing a line that makes everyone less safe? Where should the line be? What's your take on operations that weaponize trust itself? Drop your perspective in the comments.